Hello and welcome to Inside the Acid-Free Box, our monthly series where Christie and I take you into the archives and collections of Holocaust Museum LA. I'm just noticing that both Christie and I do not have our names up, so I'm just going to change that very quickly so you can remember who we are. Thank you so much for joining this month's series. We are looking at the righteous among the nations and exploring some different collections that we have at Holocaust Museum LA, featuring those non-Jews who risked their lives to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. As many of you know, but for those of you who are joining us for your first time, Holocaust Museum LA was initially founded by a group of Holocaust survivors in 1961 who wanted to create a space to honor those who had passed, as well as the survivors in the community, maintain primary sources in order to educate future generations and inspire a more dignified and humane world. We were able to open our permanent museum home in 2010, nestled in Pan Pacific Park, where we have quite a large collection of primary source artifacts from the Holocaust, one of the largest Holocaust collections on the West Coast. And each month we invite you, our audience, our community, to join me and Christie and explore the different collections that we have. So just the image that we're using on the screen for the Righteous Among the Nations is the medal that is awarded by Yad Vashem to those who are awarded that title. We'll get to a little bit of that history in just a bit. First, I would love to have Christie tell us a little bit about our archival collection at the museum.
Yeah, so for those of you that are joining for the first time, that you haven't heard this information before, as Jordanna mentioned, we have quite a substantial collection at the museum. So it's around 610 collections and sub-collections with about approximately 20,000 facts, documents, and other materials. So many of the collections relate to a particular person or family and include materials like photographs, documents, three-dimensional objects, so things like badges, pins, or textiles or other family heirlooms that survived the Holocaust. And then we also have a collection of survivor testimony as well. So the collections that we're going to discuss today relate to just a sample of some of the incredible stories of individuals who helped to protect Jews during the Holocaust. And most of our collections on this subject have been donated by those who were rescued. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those individual families today.
And just the collection sits in our museum. Most of the collections that deal with those who rescued Jews during the Holocaust are in our 6th gallery, Rescue and Resistance, where we explore these courageous and heroic stories. Of course, really, if we look at Holocaust history, we learn about the capacity of human beings to do the utmost horrific things to one another, but we can also learn about the capacity of those few who did the courageous and heroic thing in spite and in despite the terror and violence that was happening all around them. And so even though, of course, there are less people who rescued than were part of the perpetrators and collaborators, it's important to examine their heroic actions in order to really understand how people can be resilient, compassionate, and care about other human beings, in some cases, ones they never even knew. So just a little bit about the Righteous Among the Nations as a title. So the Righteous Among the Nations are non-Jewish individuals who've been honored by Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum based in Jerusalem in Israel. And they are honored for risking their lives to aid Jews during the Holocaust. The background is of Yad Vashem, I should mention. Yad Vashem was established in 1953 by the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, as a way to commemorate what transpired during the Holocaust. And within 10 years, actually a commission of Holocaust experts and survivors were formed to delegate the criteria for awarding the honor of Righteous Among the Nations. In order to be awarded a Righteous Among the Nations, the individual being awarded needs to have their motivation for helping Jews to have not been any sort of personal gain, whether it was being paid or receiving a business or a home. And so really the motivation is meant to be humanitarian only. So those who have been named Righteous Among the Nations actually receive honorary citizenship in Israel. and are honored in the Garden of the Righteous, which you can actually see the plaque in front of you here. And each of the medals are actually that are awarded to the recipients have a quote which comes from the Talmud. And the quote is, "And whoever saves a life is considered as if he saved the entire world, excuse me." So rescue took many forms, and the righteous came from different nations, religions, and walk of lives. There are some very well-known righteous among the nations, like Oskar Schindler, made very famous by Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg. Oskar Schindler was a man of great power and gain and financial abilities, and was able to use all of that to help rescue Jews during the Holocaust. But there were rescuers who came from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, poor backgrounds, rich backgrounds, who rescued neighbors and best friends, who rescued complete strangers, either because they were opposed to Nazi beliefs or opposed to the violence that they were witnessing, or understood that Jews were just fellow human beings. These individuals showed extraordinary courage and compassion in rescuing Jewish friends, neighbors, and even complete strangers, often at significant risk to themselves and their own families. In many cases, if a person was caught for rescuing a Jewish family or trying to rescue a Jewish family, they and their entire families could be publicly executed as a warning to those in the towns or in their surroundings not to do this. Other times they were deported to concentration camps. A lot of the punishments varied, but it is, whether in Western Europe or in England or in Eastern Europe, it was well known that it was truly risking their lives in order to rescue Jews. So here's, like I mentioned, that medal that each one of the righteous are awarded. They also receive a statue, a plaque, the honorary Israeli citizenship. And then at Yad Vashem, there is this garden where every single name is inscribed in stone based on the country that they were from, as well as the year in which they were honored. So here you can see under Germany, Elizabeth Gessler, who we will be talking about later. But every single person we mentioned in this PowerPoint, in this presentation, every single person you can research online who's received this prestigious award is included on this really beautiful, tranquil garden where people can go and honor these courageous human beings. So the first individual we'll be focusing on is Adele Stopholds. She was initially born in Germany. Her parents were of Polish descent. Really, following World War I, there was a lot of movement and immigration between different countries in Europe. And Adele's parents immigrated to Germany in hopes of a better life. Unfortunately, her mother perished or died in childbirth. And so she was raised by her single father. However, after the Nazis took power, they forcibly removed all Polish Jews in Germany against their will, and sort of just illegally pushed them to the Polish border. So Adele ends up in a Jewish orphanage because her father had been forcibly deported to Poland by the Nazis in 1934. She lives in this orphanage for a few years until it is destroyed during Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was an event that took place in November of 1938, where there was widespread violence instituted by the state government, the Nazi government, in which Jewish homes and businesses were broken into. Synagogues were set on flame. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. There was incredible destruction. In fact, Adele remembers the next day sorting through the rubble of the orphanage, trying to find some photographs, some fragments, some possessions of hers. She is then subsequently put on a kinder transport to Belgium. I think most of us, when we hear kinder transport, we think of the United Kingdom. It is true that the United Kingdom took in 10,000 Jewish children during this time period. However, Jewish refugee children were desperate to get out, or parents were desperate to get their kids out. Many were sent also to Belgium and the Netherlands. Unfortunately, they later come under Nazi control. So upon arriving in Brussels in 1939, Adele was taken in by a mother-daughter, Marie and Germaine. They at first just took her in. It was known that she was Jewish. They took her in as a Jewish refugee fleeing the Nazis in Germany. However, after the invasion of Belgium in 1940, they register her with fake papers as a non-Jew. They then protect her for the entirety of the Holocaust, securing false identities for her, enrolling her in a Catholic school. and she thus survives. She later finds out that her father perished during the Holocaust. She then nominated the women to receive the honor of Richest Among the Nations at Yad Vashem, which they were awarded in 1992. So here we have a photograph of Adele's parents before she was born. I believe this was their wedding photo. So her mother died in childbirth. And then here's Adele as a little girl. And I know, Christie, you have some artifacts for us to show us.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that so Adele's father was forcibly sent back to Poland, and she was initially placed with a family, but then it became too dangerous for them to house her any longer, and so she was put into the Rothschild Jewish orphanage. And we actually have a photo. It's very small, so hold it as close as possible. And Adele is actually in the bottom row sitting. It's just a little bit hard to see, but yeah, as you mentioned, Jordanna, the orphanage was destroyed during Kristallnacht. So it's incredible that a photo from that time survived, not to mention the other photos that you just showed up on the screen. And Adele talks about it in her testimony, the fact that, she's known for having these photos and there being, these really important possessions to her. And you can understand why, because, in the destruction, for having everything be destroyed and any, worldly possessions that you had taken away or destroyed. So something like this was obviously really precious to her. So that was part of the collection something that we actually have on display in the first gallery that looks at the Jewish life in Europe before the Holocaust. And so, yeah, and then the other photo that we were just looking at too was also, so is eventually, as you mentioned, sent on the kinder transport and placed with the Goosens. So, and this is a picture of Jermaine and of the Goosens with Adele sitting around the kitchen table at their home. And so this was obviously after she was placed with them around 1943. And so they actually protected her, even though, they were only intending to have her in their home for a brief period while she was in transit, to have her then ultimately be protected with them throughout the entirety of the war. And then, they, went to the lengths of getting her fake identification and really protecting her Jewish identity, even though at that time she talks about the fact that, it was known when she was first placed with them that she was Jewish. And then as it became increasingly dangerous to be Jewish, it became this kind of open secret in their town, and the women protected her, and the other people that she became acquainted with really protected her secret. Have the fake ID that the Goosens were able to secure for her as well. And she also talks about this in her testimony. So you can see it has a real photo of her, and it actually has her correct name on there. It does have a date of birth that makes her 2 years younger than she actually was. And the address on there is actually to just like an empty lot. It wasn't actually a real address that was on the identification card. And so I think we have a little bit of a excerpt from her testimony where she's actually talking about, the increased restrictions and the very first instance of, the Goosens protecting her and really saving her life.
It's really interesting that you mentioned how Marie and Jermaine were hiding, at first took Adele in, and it was known in their town that she was a Jewish refugee child. And then after 1940, when the Nazis invade, this now becomes a communal secret. And for so many, there are many different stories in which we hear that the families hiding Jews were so terrified of their neighbors turning them in, of their neighbors hearing the wrong noise, or seeing them bring in too much food, or seeing a light on in the attic at night. But then you also hear stories of how the entire town or neighbors simply knew that there was a family hiding a Jewish child and never said anything to the Nazis. And oftentimes the Nazis would invite people to turn in their neighbors. And that is how they gained so much information about who were hiding Jews.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because aside from Jermaine and Marie, Adele talks about in her testimony and throughout the collection, it wasn't just these two women. She also befriended a family, or she made a friend while she was enrolled in public school, that became a lifelong friend. And that woman, whose name was Annie, and her parents also were aware of her Jewish identity and protected her, and she would spend vacations with them and go to their house, and and so they were also an important part of protecting her, and were also awarded the Righteous Among the Nations. And then there was another Catholic nun that was involved as well, who we'll talk about a little bit later. So yeah, there was definitely many people, particularly in Adele's story. You see there was many people that were aware of her Jewish identity and actively worked to protect her.
At first, the Jewish people could go about their business and nothing happened, but I know that in 1940 already, the children were not allowed to go. 41, we weren't allowed to go to public schools any longer, and the edict of the Yellow Star came out, and my aunties just went to the city hall because they thought they should get my star. And luckily, the clerk who was at the window where we were said, "Take the girl home and don't give me her name." And it saved my life, obviously. Because as far as the Germans, I never existed. I never had an official record at that particular time yet. So I went underground at that particular time. I didn't exist. I didn't get any stamps for food stamps, or I just was a non-entity. And in 1941, they also made sure that whenever the Germans came into the store, that I was not around or near downstairs, because they felt that if they would hear an accent, maybe there would be a Nazi coming in. Most of the Germans who came into the store were eager to get merchandise, because merchandise at that time, the Germans had nothing anymore in Germany. So the occupying forces were in the beginning very polite and they had been told to be very proper, but they went into the stores and got any merchandise they could get hold of. And being that my aunties were very true Christians, it used to hurt them to hear the stories. It's very cold in Germany, we need warm sweaters for our children, and they tried very hard not to sell them, so they always said they didn't have this size or they didn't have this. They sold very little, as little to the Germans as they could, and that was their way to, what would I say, when you...
To protest.
To protest, right.
I think it's such an interesting thing that you mentioned, in the sense that, well, one, when the Nazis invade in 1940, there's this edict that goes out that all Jews have to register and receive their yellow star, but register where they live. This is what made it very easy for the Nazis later on to go and arrest and deport so many Jews in Western Europe. And it sounds as, so she refers to them as her aunties. They went to go do the thing that they were told legally. And if not for this man at the station who found it in his heart to say, take her back, pretend she was never here, do not register her. This definitely helped save her life. And she also mentions this thing about food stamps. For many people hiding Jews, it was as if they didn't exist, even if they had false identity cards. And so that meant that they weren't rationed for food. So in that way, food became even more scarce. Coal became scarce. It was very difficult. There were many daily challenges facing those who were risking their lives each day to save a Jewish person.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that you mentioned that, Jordanna, because she mentions it. I can't remember if it was in the Shoah testimony, or we also have like written testimony from the her like efforts to get the Goosens and the other people involved in her story recognized by Yad Vashem. But she talks about the fact that she never, wanted for anything. Like, even though it was obviously really difficult, she was a non-identity, so she wasn't registered anywhere, so there wasn't food rations and things allocated for her, but they made it so, and her childhood in a way was protected so much that she never really felt that need.
So I know you have some of these objects to show us. I believe that this is her friend that you were referencing earlier.
Yes. It is Annie, her name was. And so her and her parents were also recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, because of Adele's efforts and because of everything that they did to help protect her during the Holocaust.
And here's Adele living her life in Belgium. And then here's the medal that you can see that was awarded to the two women. Oh, here, hold on. Let me stop the share so you can show us what you have.
So we have those objects. So we have the medal, which is actually usually on display in our 6th gallery that talks about rescue and resistance. And so, Jordanna showed it before with the image of it. So that was the medal that was awarded to Marie and Jermaine Goosen for protecting Adele. And then we have some of those other photos on display in the gallery as well as the one that I showed before of the 3 women around the kitchen table from 1943, which is a kind of an interesting photo to me. I never really thought about it, but looking at it, it feels like such a very, like, it's obviously some sort of professional photograph because they're very much staged. There's a like a fashion magazine on the table. They just kind of look like the epitome of a happy family in this photo.
And then the medal, can you show it to us one more time? Because I think I showed only one side. And this is the other side. So one side has that quote. And then here it actually says, I believe, the names of the rescuers on it with an etching of the building of Yad Vashem. And it's presented in a box that's made out of olive tree wood, because in Judaism, olive trees are a sign of peace. Yes, and that is how it's presented. And actually, Adele's family loaned this to the museum as an example and to honor her aunties who saved her life during the war. So then another very interesting part of the story is that her aunties enroll her in a Catholic school. And she makes friends in the Catholic school. She does her homework. She attends class. She attends Catholic prayers. And the only woman who was aware at the school was the principal of the school. And on the day of the class photo, she actually goes to Adele and says, there's going to be a photograph taken, fearful that perhaps somebody would recognize Adele somehow as a Jewish person and alert the authorities. She says, shake your face vigorously when the camera clicks. So you can see here's Adele with a blurred face so that it is nearly impossible to identify who she is. And really that sort of critical thinking of here's a classroom of students. For all they know, their family members could be connected to the collaborating government or the Nazis and would turn in a Jewish child. And so in order to further protect her identity, she comes up with this idea and tells Adele to shake her face and blur the image.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably easier to look at the photo on the presentation, but maybe if I can, you can see she's in the middle right there, so her face is blurry.
It's just incredible to think, each and every day, the thoughtful actions that needed to take place, that it wasn't just one decision, but it was a decision and a hardship made every single day during the entirety of the Holocaust.
Yeah, and the nun, so Madame Eulalie, she was actually, as you mentioned, entrusted with the knowledge and obviously protected Adele's identity, and then was ultimately also recognized by Yad Vashem as well. So then this is just a little bit about Adele, again, kind of talking about her experiences and her rescuers. So maybe before we dive into that, just a little bit about what happened to her after the war. So I think we touched on it before, but she ultimately discovers after the war has ended, she's able to make contact with her cousin, and she finds out that her father has likely been killed during the Holocaust. And so she's able to eventually make contact with her father's relatives who were in the US, and they invited her to come and visit. And so she went to come and stay what was initially meant to be temporarily, but ended up being that she meets her husband Ben and their 2 children, Yvette and Debbie, and the family eventually moves to LA and settles there. So During that time, though, she, remains in close contact with the Goosens. They essentially become her adopted family, particularly because she's lost the rest of her biological family. And so she makes visits to Germaine, who is still living at that time. And Germaine comes out to stay with her in the US as well. And ultimately, she reaches out to Yad Vashem to have them recognized as righteous among the nations. And we actually have some of the paperwork that she kind of put forward to have them recognized. So you can see there's, many letters back and forth, testimony that talks about the story. And her, obviously she felt very passionate about having them recognized for what they had done for her. But yeah, we can watch a little bit about that, about the clip.
Made some decisions that you think are directly related to your experience with the Goosens or their experience during those years in Belgium?
I think that it tinted my whole outlook in life. I think so. I think that perhaps I think that your character isn't only formed because of your genes. I think it comes from your surroundings, and I think that I'm really lucky I was raised by these two people. I think that they were so very broad-minded in so many ways that I can look at different people. I know that I grew up totally unprejudiced towards people who are not like me. I know that.
As a result.
And so interesting to me to listen to her talk. There was this clip, and then there's also another point in the testimony where she talks about how lucky she was. And yes, as somebody obviously who survived the Holocaust, there was definitely an element of luck, but to hear somebody who survived the Holocaust and lived through that time talk about how lucky she was to have met these women, and how her childhood she felt so loved and she was so spoiled, is just an incredible thing to me.
And I think it really, when we speak at the museum about how our actions can dictate and have a different reaction from other people, and really what it means to be an upstander in a community, here she is saying that it's not just about like nature versus nurture. It's not just about who she was born to or the experience she went through and watching all of this destruction and hatred, but the fact that she felt love from at first complete strangers who then became her family shapes her to be a positive person. So when we really look at the resiliency of people that experience kindness, they in turn become kind people. And that really speaks to the impact and ripple effect of being a courageous person. So even though, at the museum, we talk about all of the horrific things that happened during the genocide, to then focus on, here's an example of how actually we can inspire a more dignified world if more people had acted like her aunties and had acted like the other individuals we'll be talking about today. So now moving to our next righteous among the nations we're going to talk about, Henk Pelzner. So he actually recognized he rescued another survivor who was in our community, Gregory McKay. And just a little bit of information about the Netherlands, I think, especially because Anne Frank is such a well-known story, and we hear a lot about the stories of the Dutch resistance in the Netherlands. It is important to just kind of understand the historical context of that area. Because 3/4 of the Dutch Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. So it was actually the largest majority in any Western European country. And this is for a few different political reasons in how the Netherlands was structured by the Nazi government. But it's really, I think, important to understand that, before 1940 in the Netherlands, there was anti-Semitism, but it was not so openly expressed, and there was no legal difference between Jews and non-Jews living in the Netherlands for nearly 150 years when the Nazis invaded in 1940. The percentage of Dutch Jews were about 1.5% of the entire population, so a larger majority than German Jews, made up in Germany at 0.8, but of course a very much smaller minority than, the number of Polish Jews making up the Polish population, which was about 10%. The great majority of Dutch Jews, actually 85% of them, had lived in the country for centuries, so really were identified as Dutch and also Jewish and could trace their lineage back in the country. When Germany invaded the Netherlands and Belgium and France at the same time in May of 1940, they very quickly took a lot of their anti-Jewish laws that they had already legislated in other countries and put them forth in these countries as well. So you can see here that, Gregory Mackay had been born in Amsterdam in 1942. So actually, after already the Nazis had invaded, his father was a doctor and a professor at the University of Amsterdam. And of course, after the Nazis invade, he loses his position for the sole reason of being a Jewish person. And in 1942, which is really, Holocaust historians look at it as the bloodiest year. Over half of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust are murdered in the year 1942. During this time when rumors are circulating and evidence is sort of becoming very apparent, one of Gregory Mackay's father's students who joined the Dutch resistance contacts him and starts to, wants to rescue Gregory's family. He at first joins the Dutch resistance and was tasked with smuggling microfilm of the Dutch coastline to the British embassy in Switzerland. And then as part of this operation, he then starts to agree to smuggle Jewish families out of the Netherlands and into Switzerland. There is at this time a lot of illegal smuggling of Jews across the border into Switzerland, mostly across the French border. It was a treacherous journey. If caught before the Swiss border, Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. If they were able to make it across the Swiss border and were caught by the Swiss, they were then actually sent to forced labor camps in Switzerland. Switzerland at this time was a neutral country. If they were able to make it successfully through Switzerland, they then were there safely, not knowing if the Nazis would ever invade. And at only 6 months at the time, so like a really small baby, Gregory was carried in a black bag. And it was a 10-day journey where the family walked for most of it. And they successfully made it to Switzerland. And Hank Pelser actually helped around 60 Jews escape to Switzerland. And for his courageous efforts, he was recognized as righteous among the nations. So it's interesting to think that even though 3/4 of the Dutch Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, the Netherlands has the largest per capita number of rescuers. So 1 in 1,700 Dutch people have been awarded for righteous among the nations. So it's a very complex and interesting micro history of this time. And so here's a photograph of baby Gregory with his mom, which I know that Christie has to show us the original from in the archive.
Yeah, so this is definitely one from the collection that is on display in the 6th gallery as well. So this is from August 1942, and it's a picture of Gregory as a baby, obviously, and his mother Sylvie. And this is was actually taken in the garden of the house that they initially went into hiding. So both his parents actually were members of the Dutch resistance, and so were active members, and particularly his father, who had certain equipment from his career. So he had a microscope and other tools of the trade from being a doctor and a professor. And so these were useful in making false papers, cutting out and attaching photographs to new identification cards. And so he was very much involved in that aspect of other underground operations. And so they quickly realized that they were facing incredible danger, and made arrangements for Sylvie and Gregory to go into hiding with a family friend. And so that was actually the family friend was actually a family who also had a baby. And so it was a good cover, because if Gregory made noise, which anybody who has ever been in the room with a 6-month-old baby would know, children make noise, and so it wouldn't arouse suspicion because there was already a baby of similar age living in that house. And so Hank Pelser, I don't know if we mentioned before, but he was a medical student, and he was actually formerly a student of Gregory's father Samuel. So He was part of efforts to organize protests, protesting against Jewish civil servants and professors being dismissed from the University of Amsterdam. Went on to become involved in the Dutch underground in various aspects. One of those being, providing false identities and, opening escape routes to neutral Switzerland through Belgium and France. And so in December of 1942, like Jordanna mentioned, he's tasked with this mission of smuggling out microfilm of the Dutch coastline to the British Embassy in Switzerland. And, initially it was considered that something like this was way too dangerous for a woman, let alone a child, to be included in. And so even though Samuel wanted his whole family to be smuggled out, initially the thought from above was, no, it's too dangerous. And so it was kind of the 11th hour that the plans changed, and he was actually able to get his family out with him. And so we have a little clip actually from testimony that was taken at the Museum of Gregory that talking about that experience. Sorry, I've jumped forward too far.
It's okay. So here, and as we mentioned, he was tasked initially with smuggling photographs of the coastline, obviously to the British Embassy in Switzerland. At this point of the war, the UK is still not under Nazi occupation and is considering, how to invade mainland Europe. For those of you who are familiar with military history, in December of 1941, the US joins the war, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then the US is now part of the war, and they're exploring different ways to invade mainland Europe. And also you can see a photograph of the bag that we have on display. So this little small black bag is what this 6-month-old baby was carried in on a over 1 week journey. And that's his little outfit that he had. And then here's a photo of Gregory as an adult with the bag that held him as a baby. And here he is with Hank holding the award that he received because he was a righteous among the nations.
My father told Hank Pelser, okay, the two of them would take off and go to Switzerland. My father said, well, I want to take my wife and baby and get him out of here. And they said, Hank Pelser checked with the other people, they said, impossible, you can't take a woman, you can't take a baby. So they made an arrangement with one of my father's fellow doctors to have me hidden in his house. He was also not Jewish. And the day before the departure, the scheduled departure, my father got a phone call from the wife of the doctor who said he's in the hospital. He was a lung doctor, a lung specialist. He has TB. We can't take the baby. So my father decided, as a desperate measure, a last moment thing, they would take my mother and me anyway. And he went and he told my grandfather about this. My grandfather said, you can't just carry a baby in your arms. I have an idea. And he had this large piece of cloth. It was a heavy cloth, black cloth. And he went to his shoemaker. And he told the shoemaker he needed a bag. He said, make a bag with handles. And make it a bag that the baby could be carried in. And the man did. He made that bag. And the bag was then brought to my grandfather. My grandfather gave it to my father. And that is the bag in which they then put me as a baby and my mother on foot, and off we went. And by that method, we left Amsterdam.
So I know that, Christie, you have some other really interesting artifacts that is part of this collection.
Yeah, so I have actually, we have the black bag on display in the gallery downstairs. It's a little bit hard to kind of maneuver and hold up for the camera. So, but we do also have the clothes that he was wearing. So we have the little hat, so teeny, and the baby jacket that he wore for the journey on display as well downstairs. And then we also have so we have some photos. So once the family did eventually make it to Switzerland, as you mentioned, after this treacherous, grueling, essentially 10-day journey that involved some by foot, on rail, by car, the family eventually reached the safety of Switzerland. And so we have some images of them during that time when they're actually in Switzerland. So this is a picture of Gregory and his parents sometime around his first birthday, taken in front of the place that they were staying. And then actually later in life, Gregory in 2003, I think retraced the family steps with his mother. And so this is a photo of them in the same spot as an adult, obviously with his mother. Yeah, so then the other thing that we have as part of the collection as well, so Hank Pelser obviously saved many people through his actions, and he actually wrote a book about his experiences. And as part of that book, he actually has this drawing, which is actually a drawing of a group hiding in the snow when a German patrol came by, while attempting to cross through the mountains from France into Switzerland. And this, according to Gregory's testimony, is actually a drawing of their group. And this is a bit, but it's actually inscribed. So when Gregory and his mother made the trip back to retrace the family steps, they visited with Hank. And this is actually inscribed to him, and it basically says, "To Gregory, whose very existence made all of my efforts worthwhile." And then we also have, as Jordanna mentioned before, there was the photo of Gregory and Hank standing together in the garden, Hank holding his award from Yad Vashem and Gregory holding the bag that he was smuggled in. And then also, as part of being recognized as righteous among the nations, there is an award ceremony, and Gregory and his mother were able to actually attend the award ceremony. So this is a photo of the three of them together.
So the last example, so we've covered really a family, two women taking in a child who they did not know, a gentleman who saved his favorite professor, and then countless others in the Netherlands. And now we're going to go to Eastern Europe and hear a little bit about Elizabeth. So at 26 years old, Elizabeth Leia, she was 26, and she was actually a Volksdeutsche, which means that she was of German descent but living in Poland. And she began working as a nanny for a Jewish family in Bielsko, Poland, for their three children, Alec, who was 11, Lily, who was 4, and Roman, who was 2 at the time. So Bielsko in Poland is part of the area of Poland that in 1939, the Nazis invade. Well, in 1939, the Nazis and the Soviet Union invade Poland and divide the country. So Bielsko falls under the Nazi territory. And actually, at the time of the invasion, David and Dora were on a vacation in Italy. And so as the Nazi army is rolling through Poland, Elizabeth actually takes the children and flees, and is able then, when David and Dora return to Poland, they're able to reconnect and sort of discuss next steps. And in that moment, the Gessler family decides that they are going to be 5 of about 250,000 Polish Jews who immediately pack up and just flee Nazi occupation and enter the Soviet zone. So they do not return back to their hometown, and they just immediately, I believe, David Gessler, who changes his name to Edward Gessler, a less Jewish sounding name, he just finds a bus driver, convinces the bus driver to just drive them across the border, kind of in hiding, and they end up in what later is called Lemberg, but in Lvov, on the eastern part of Poland that is under Soviet territory, which is where they remain. And in this moment, actually, Elizabeth decides that she is going to remain with the family. I mean, as a German national, she is entitled to have had a mansion given to her by the Nazi government. A lot of Volksdeutsche in that area were given money, big houses, at the loss of Polish Jews and Polish Catholics. And instead, she decides to just accompany the family to Lvov. So they live in Lvov until 1941. In June of 1941, the Nazis break their peaceful arrangement with the Soviets and invade the Soviet Union. And this is actually the beginning of the mass murder of the European Jews. So using the cover of war, Nazi units begin rounding up Jews and just shooting them. This is really, I think, on the part of Edward, now Gessler, the father. He kind of saw the writing on the wall. And even before the invasion, he secured false identity papers for the family, saying that they were from Costa Rica, which I always found very funny because none of them spoke Spanish. So I actually once asked, what would happen if somebody asked you, to speak Spanish? What would you say? And they said that they would say, oh yeah, of course we speak Spanish, but we also speak German and we also speak Polish. And then of course, nobody in Lvov spoke Spanish. And so nobody would really second guess them. So after the Nazi invasion, the family actually had been working on trying to get out of Poland and into Costa Rica with these fake identity cards that listed them as Costa Rican. Unfortunately, Edward is actually arrested. So by the time he's able to get out using his, charisma, the Nazis have already invaded and the borders are really closed and the family cannot get out. Thus, the family actually decides to split up, and Elizabeth takes the two younger children, Lily and Roman. And they all have Aryan. Well, she of course is not Jewish, but the rest of the family is given Aryan papers. She actually has the two younger children baptized and gets them baptismal papers. And she teaches them Christian prayers. She dyes their hair blonde. She says that they are her own children. She registers them as her own children. She actually wrote to her family in Nazi Germany and said that she had had an affair with a married Polish man and had two children out of wedlock, which was a true shame for her at that time, but does this in order to protect the children. And so she takes the children on their own. She is able to reconnect with David and Elik, the oldest child, in Hungary. She actually takes the two younger children on foot across the Carpathian Mountains in the dead of night. She is, she manages to out-talk herself with Gestapo officers. At one point, she's actually arrested, but is able to get out again. And it actually saves these two children. Once the family reunites in Hungary, of course, then they reunite in early 1944, and then in the summer of 1944, Nazi Germany invades its ally Hungary and starts deporting Jewish people. But since they have these non-Jewish identity cards, they're able to smuggle themselves across the border into Romania. So it's definitely again, all of these different moments of risk and intense opportunity to be caught. It's not just about making like one decision to save, but it's about making the decision every single day to save and rescue someone. So then in 2007, Yad Vashem recognizes Elizabeth as righteous among the nations, with the honor being accepted on behalf of Lily and Roman Gessler, the two young children she saved. You might be wondering how her last name changes to Gessler, the name of the family. So Dora Gessler died in the Holocaust, and following the Holocaust, David and Elizabeth get married and actually live the rest of their lives married together in Vienna. This is actually her Nazi certificate, and this was a very important piece of document for her because even though she had been born in Poland, identifying herself as an actual German was important. Every single time they got stopped, they were asked for their papers. It allowed her to kind of maneuver and manipulate conversations and more easily lie. It was less likely for her to be doubted as a member of the Nazi party than if she had just been a Polish woman. So this was very important for them. Here you can see on the right-hand side a copy of Roman's baptismal certificate. And this was done in Lvov in 1941. And then you can see on the left, actually Roman and Lily's first communion that they did. Roman, being so young at the time of the war breaking out, actually never knew that he wasn't Jewish. He just knew that he had to lie constantly and wasn't quite sure of like what the truth was. And it wasn't until after the Holocaust that he learned that he actually was a Jewish person. On the left-hand side, you can see David, who later, they all had changed their names, and David stuck with Edward for the rest of his life. So you can see Edward with Roman and Lily as kids. You can see Roman and Lily in the middle, and then Alec. This is probably the earliest photo taken of him. Of course, the family doesn't have any pre-war photographs because they were constantly fleeing, and photographs don't oftentimes have monetary value, so were left behind. And so you can see Alec, this is probably taken in 1946. And then here you can see Edward Gessler and Ellie in the summer of 1975. Like I said, they moved to Vienna. They lived in Vienna for the rest of their lives. They were buried there. They always had a Yorkshire Terrier as a pet. So you can see that in this photograph. And here's a more clear, younger photo of them walking around Vienna. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of Alec with his grandchildren. The girl in the green is me. So this is really a story of my own grandfather. And again, talking about the ripple effect of people, you know, being an upstander. I don't think that Elizabeth, as a 26-year-old, thought, oh, I'm going to risk my life multiple times to save children who then ultimately will go on and marry them, have families of their own and have grandchildren of their own, and kind of have this ripple effect. And so I think what's so critical for us when we talk about righteous among the nations and those who risk their lives is, again, is the decision-making process. There are countless stories of families who were rescuing and hiding Jews who one day woke up and said, I don't want to do this anymore, and kicked the Jewish family out. There are countless examples of that because of the pressure, the violence, the constant threat of death. I've heard my grandfather talk about how in a town where they were in hiding, the entire town was brought to the town square because a Jewish family had been found in hiding with a Catholic family, and the Nazis lined up every single member of both family and shot them as a warning that this is what will happen if you were caught hiding Jews. And so for him to see that happening as a Jewish man, or a kid, I guess he was probably 12 or 13 years old at the time, and to maintain composure and not even give away the fact that he was Jewish. And so it's really not, it's easy to kind of look at the larger picture, but forget that each and every decision made was definitely painful and definitely difficult, and ultimately created a more positive space, which I think is sort of what my takeaway is from these stories. Christie, what would your takeaway be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nice note to end on the fact that it's a personal story for you. I mean, even though it wasn't necessarily a collection that we have at the museum, it definitely deserved an honorary mention, I think. And, you know, it really rings home the fact that to think about, obviously, the actions that these people took are incredible and courageous, like you said, in the face of, you know, incredible terror, essentially. But it really does have that ripple effect impact. You know, you might, if it not for her actions, you might not be here today. So.
And this is a great time. If anyone has any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them in the next few minutes. We really appreciate you joining us today and learning about this important piece of Holocaust history. As I said, even though most of the time when we study the Holocaust, we're learning about the genocide and the destruction of a rich tapestry of culture and Jewish life, it's so important to understand that in the face of that, people did actually do the courageous thing. And I believe, so the Righteous Among the Nations department at Yad Vashem still honors people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. Of course, it's more difficult to learn of the stories because this is a population that we are losing, but people are still honored to this day. There's a beautiful ceremony. Oftentimes they're honored after they've passed, with their families receiving the awards. I believe over 23,000 people have been honored. The number might be even higher at this point. And it's just a really special way, I think, to remember that one quote that's etched on the medal, that for somebody to save a person, it is as if they saved the world. So We have a question about a tentative date to reopen the museum. Excellent question. The museum will be reopening July 1. We're very excited. You can check out our website, hmla.org or holocaustmuseumla.org. We will be asking for time ticketing just to abide by certain reopen standards, but we would love to have you and everyone here come to the museum and see these artifacts on display, see them in real life, examine them, understand the greater historical context of the Holocaust and what these individuals did and what that impact really was. And then how many righteous among the nations are recognized? Like I said, it's, I think, over 23,000 from all over Europe and from all different backgrounds. There are people of different faiths. I think the 3 people we discussed were Christian, but there are people of Muslim faith who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, particularly in Southern Europe. There are people, like I mentioned earlier, who were rich, who were poor, people from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Romania, Turkey, Moldova, really almost every single country in which the Nazis were present, there were people rescuing Jews. Great question. Who were these people who made all these false papers? Were any of them recognized? So sometimes there were even Jewish people making false papers. So like we said earlier, I believe Gregory Mackay's father, who himself was a Dutch Jew, was part of the Dutch resistance falsifying these papers. Other times the false papers were purchased, which means that those people would not be considered righteous among the nations. So I know for my family, their papers and documents were purchased. So those people would not be honored because they did it for monetary gain and not for humanity. So that's also a great question. Additionally, Yad Vashem has honored groups of people. So if like a resistance group is known to have smuggled Jews, but not every single person's name is known, Yad Vashem will honor the entire group. This is also true in Denmark for the Danish resistance. The group as a whole is honored because of their noteworthy activity in rescuing nearly 93% of the Danish Jewish population. So truly, there are so many incredible stories that you can hear of people rescuing strangers, rescuing friends, rescuing loved ones, risking their lives, and doing so just because they believed in the good in humanity. And I think, as I said earlier, when there is such a destructive, horrible history, we have to look at those positive stories because that will give us light and hopefully inspire us to act in honor of these people and act in honor of those who did these heroic deeds, and hopefully then start to change the space in which we live and to make it more positive. Just like Adele said, it's not always where we come from biologically, but it's about who we learn from and how do we become a more positive person. So on that note, if we don't, a question about how I'm connected to the Gesslers. Great question. So my grandfather, I'll just quickly get my little thing. So that's me as a small child. That's my brother, whose 26th birthday is actually today. So he was not joining us. This is one of my cousins who actually is joining us today. And this is my little sister. And so this was my grandfather, and his father and his stepmother is who rescued the family during the Holocaust. And so she changed her name to Gessler when she married my great grandfather following the war. So if you're interested in learning more about Righteous Among the Nations, the entire database is digitized. So you can go to righteous.yadvashem.org or just Google Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem. You can search by country, you can search by nationality, you can see their featured stories and really learn more about these incredible people. And just as a last note, as we're nearing the ends of our program, we always thank you so much for joining these programs that we put on. If you're ever interested in learning more about our programs or special opportunities, you can become a member at Holocaust Museum LA. Check out our website, hmla.org/membership. You can always reach out to us as well. If you're interested in more incredible and enriching programs like this one, you can join us tomorrow, June 16th at 5 p.m. For a program about The Jewish Ghetto Girls Who Fought the Nazis. This is an event in partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation, who we used some testimony from today. They're excellent partners in our community and in our work. And it will be a discussion with an author, about the author of the book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos. So today we learned a little bit about the non-Jews who resisted the Nazis, and this is an event where you can learn more about Jewish resistance against the Nazis. I highly recommend joining us this Thursday, June 17th at 11 a.m. Pacific, to hear the story of a Holocaust survivor. Stephen was born in Budapest in 1941. His parents were sent to a forced labor camp. They handed Stephen, just a small child, a toddler actually, off to a Red Cross operative who placed him in a safe house under the protection of Swedish diplomats. So this will be an incredible story again of rescue and resistance and people who stood up and did the right thing in the face of destruction and violence. I really recommend joining to hear a Holocaust survivor share. And as always, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you next month for our next installment of Inside the Acid Free Box. My name is Jordanna, and we have Christie, who is joining us from inside the archive at the museum, even though her accent would fool you that she's joining us from Australia. Thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful evening.